Okay. Woo. Got it. Can you guys hear me? Okay. My name is Amanda Bittner. Hi, everyone. I am the incoming department head of Memorial's Department of Political Science. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. As it happens, today is National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. Many workplaces have given employees the time off to observe this day, which is an important gesture. Memorial University is not one of those workplaces, but this gives us an opportunity to think together about what that National Indigenous Peoples Day means, why it's important to commemorate this day. The Canadian government reports that for generations, many Indigenous groups and communities have celebrated their culture and heritage on June 21st, or around that time of year, because of the significance of the summer solstice as the longest day of the year. Looking around us now, here is in delightfully balmy St. John's. It's tough to imagine that the summer solstice is a real thing, although I think that your arrival here is coinciding with a bit of sun after months and months of rain, drizzle, and fog. I'd like to welcome you all to our beautiful city on the edge of the rock. I'm so thrilled to be here with you all today. It's my understanding that this workshop is structured around three interrelated questions. First, what is the function of trust in achieving a cohesive, well-integrated democracy? Second, what role does trust play in theories and processes of immigrant integration? And third, how can trust be built in societies confronted by historic injustice of the type experienced by Indigenous peoples and minority groups? These questions are really important. They're really weighty. They're questions that are not easy to answer, but that are so important to discuss. And I can think of no more fitting day to discuss these questions than today, National Indigenous Peoples Day. It gives us a chance to reflect upon the history of this land, our communities, and how they have been impacted by colonialism. It gives us a clear opportunity to discuss our relationship to the land, to each other, and how we came to be here. And it gives us a chance to identify the ways in which we each individually and collectively might disrupt and dismantle colonialism beyond land acknowledgements and commemorative symbolic gestures. It gives us a chance to talk about how we can live together, work together, and do community together better. Thank you all for coming to Memorial to have this important conversation. And thank you to my colleagues, Dr. Panagos, Dr. Bakfarova, Dr. Rybold, and Dr. Leonard for organizing what I anticipate will be a hugely generative and productive workshop. If there's anything that I can do to make your visit here more pleasant, please let me know. I worked at Memorial for 15 years and I've lived here for a little bit longer than that. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about this place if I can. I'm hoping to participate in the workshop over the coming days as much as possible, as much as my other responsibilities will allow. And I look forward to learning from you all. Thank you.
Good morning from us as well. We're really happy that you all made this really long trip, and we really appreciate that you made this long trip. So we'll just give you kind of like some practical information. The first is that we want to acknowledge all the funders who made it possible to bring you here. So one is the Social Sciences and Research Council Canada, who has funded your travels. Then the Good Integration Project at the University of Tromsø, which is funded by the Norwegian Research Council. We also got money from MUN and from the University of New Brunswick, which is funding everything else, your hotels and your food, et cetera, et cetera. Then a little note of why you're all sitting here, if you don't sit there voluntarily. We are recording this, and we are planning to put the talks online, maybe also the Q&A. If you're uncomfortable with that, if you do not want either your talk to be online or your part in the Q&A, please do send us an email and we will make sure to cut it out. So even though it's recorded, it doesn't, you can at any time kind of object that this will go public, but we hope that you would all agree to share that, so that people who were not able to make the long travel maybe can also get something out of this workshop. Well, this conference actually is the main conference of the project.
The only thing I want to say is a preemptive thank you to the student assistants for the workshop, Rachel and Brett. Bailey, sorry, Bailey Brett, Rachel and Bailey Brett, who will be with us throughout the workshop. And behind the scenes, students do really essential things to keep things running. So that's who they are. And thanks.
And I have something less interesting to say, but important. If you need to use the restroom, you exit here, go left, and it's down the first corridor this way. So that's where it is. All right, that's all we have.
I think we start right away with the first keynote, right? So our first keynote unfortunately couldn't be with us other than online, but we're still very happy that Gina Gustafsson of Uppsala University has agreed to give a keynote. So she is here. And so the format for the keynote is about 45 minutes talk, and then we'll have opportunities for a Q&A. And we will pass around this mic for the Q&A so that she can hear as well. Yes, and otherwise, we're very happy to hear Gina talk on national identity and trust from mainly a Swedish perspective.
Thank you for that. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, great. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I really wish I could have come. The thing is, I have a tiny little baby. She's just about 2 months old. So traveling to Canada from Sweden would have been, I think, quite a challenge at this time. But I do hope I can come at some other point. And I will talk today about national identity and trust, and how they have what I call a Janus-faced, so a two-faced relationship for and in diverse democracies. And I'm under the impression that my talk is about 1 hour. Is that correct, Kerstin? Or that? And I can't see, but you should interrupt me in case I've misunderstood that. But that's what I've been aiming for, at least. And then I look forward to your comments and questions. So the main points I want to make, and this is not supposed to be like a detective novel, so I'll just reveal them straight away, are 3. So what I want to do first is to give you a bit of background and then dive into these 3 points. And they are, you could say, my main conclusions from having researched the relationship between national identity and trust, but also, generally speaking, more broadly, solidarity for a couple of years. The first of these is that national identity remains, whether we like it or not, a persistent and very powerful emotional identity, and also among the highly educated people in Western Europe, those people who are sometimes called the anywheres. So this is based partly on an introduction that I wrote together with David Miller to an edited volume we did called Liberal Nationalism and Its Critics, and I'll come back to that. My second point is that when gauging the social effects of this very powerful identity, it is really crucial to take into account that it is multidimensional. And even more than that, it's also important to go beyond, I argue, the civic-ethnic distinction, which political theorists especially have been very focused on. And I'm not claiming it is unimportant, but what I want to claim is that there are other dimensions as well that have more to do with the emotional attachment to the national identity than its normative content, which is what the civic-ethnic distinction is mainly about. and that these dimensions all matter for example, trust. And then thirdly, I want to complicate the picture by bringing in research on how these links look for immigrants and their descendants, and also when taking into account immigrants and their descendants in the case of Sweden. But I will actually not only be talking about the case of Sweden, because some of the data here is cross-national, and I'll try to remember to point out where it's from. So finally, I also wanted to say that this third point relates to a fourth one that I didn't put up there and that I'm very interested in. And I know some at this conference have researched this, and that's the fact that, of course, not all trust is actually beneficial for democracy. I know Patty Leonard has worked on this, for example. The philosopher Nora O'Neill has written about it, and the political scientist Pippa Norris has recently written a whole book about it, about how we should engage in critical, sometimes even distrust, rather than trust. And she makes the distinction between distrust and mistrust. And I'm doing this in my ongoing survey research, and I'm looking forward to having something to report on that in future talks. Right. So let's begin then with a bit of background, which will be no news to you, that democracy today is threatened from many sides, but my focus has been mainly these three that I call the three-headed hound of Hades. And first, we have this notion of trust that I'll be focusing on today, the plummeting trust, both in social terms, trust in people in general, and in political terms, trusting politicians, trusting institutions, trusting the system, so to speak, trusting democracy even. All these types of trust seem to be, to some extent, eroding across democracies today. And then there's also, but I won't talk about that today, but this is part of my ongoing research, a fear that we have a growing affective polarization, which is another word for basically demonizing your political opponents, thinking that they are not only wrong, which is fair and legitimate, of course, but also untrustworthy or even evil. And thirdly, there is what I've here called an eroding solidarity with immigrants, but you could also go further and say that there is a disconcerting trend of clear anti-immigrant sentiments and parties, not least in Europe. Right, so we'll be focusing on number one here, though, on plummeting trust, and then national identity comes in here because from the liberal nationalist camp, some of whom also call themselves critical patriots, for a couple of years now, people have argued, and I have done so myself as well, that the antidote to these problems, including plummeting trust, could be a national identity in some benign form. And this, of course, might seem counterintuitive, because you might think that the problems, to some extent, are in fact inflamed nationalism, exclusive nationalism. But the idea here is that strong national identities that are inclusive are possible, and that they can provide the glue we need for keeping ethnically and culturally diverse societies together, after all. So on this view, the problem is not too much, but too little identity. But of course, of the shared overarching and cross-cutting common in-group kind, the one that can bring groups together despite cultural and ethnic and other differences. Now, this notion typically goes under the name of the national identity argument. And the books I've put up here all bring up this claim in different forms. This claim that national identity can boost some form of trust and cohesion has also, as you, I'm sure, have noticed in different contexts, found its way out of academia and into highly contentious political debates in many countries. And it's been used to undergird policies such as, for example, the now mandatory posters of British values on school walls across Britain, and things like cultural canons on everything from literature to design in Denmark, for example, and now more recently also in my own country, Sweden. And in many countries also the idea that we need mandatory citizenship tests that require immigrants to profess their commitment to a list of so-called national values. Now, I will later on argue that the national identity argument can be separated from the idea of having to share values. Identity and values are, in my view, which relies on social identity theory from psychology, not to be equated to one another. So, this was the national identity argument. And what do we know then about this empirical claim? To which extent is it true? Well, there's been quite a lot of research and there's mixed results. Some studies find that national identity does indeed seem to raise trust. For example, Canadian studies tend to find that. Johnston et al. Are Canadian studies. The Robinson study actually looked at this in a rather new country, Malawi, and also found a similar link. And Elizabeth Thies Morse looked at this quite some time ago in the US and also found a positive link here. But there are also plenty of other studies that do not find the expected positive link between national identity and trust, or even that there is a link, but it's negative, so that national identity seems to undermine trust. And here we have a study by my colleague Karen Breidal and also Nils Holtug and some other colleagues in Denmark, and one by Tim Rieskins and Matt Wright, for example, that is cross-national. The data is cross-national. Now, when I talk about the national identity argument, I should say, it's important to say which type, which understanding of the argument I focus on. And my focus has been, and is on this talk as well, on the weaker, not stronger version of it. So the weaker version is the idea that there is a probabilistic individual level relationship between national identity of some form and trust of some form. This is how empiricists tend to think about correlations and covariation. And when they say that something leads to something else, they mean that raising X, in this case, say, national attachment, will, all else equal, tend to raise the outcome Y, and in this case, trust, all else equal. I think this is important to point out because when political theorists discuss these matters, there is sometimes a focus only on a stronger version of the national identity argument, which is about necessity. And that is not the same thing. So when theorists say that there is a link between X and Y, they tend to have in mind that this is a necessary link such that if there is no X, then there will be no Y. In other words, in this context, it would be the claim that if there is no national identity, then there will be no trust. And that, of course, builds on sort of an underlying assumption that this is the main factor causing that outcome. That, I think, is to go much too far. So what I'm talking about is a probabilistic relationship. If more national identity of some kind, then there tends to be more trust. Right. Now, this was the background, and now I'll get into my first point, which is this notion that national identities are, whether we like it or not, still very persistent and powerful. And here I'll just show you a few graphs from this introduction to mine and David Miller's edited volume on liberal nationalism and its critics. This first one shows you the amount of people who say that they are either very close, the blue line, or close to their country. And here you see 3 points over time for each country. And what really is the takeaway here is that times have changed when it comes to travel, immigration, not least, of course, social media, the internet. Between 1995, which is when you see the first measurement here, and 2013, which is the last, the third bar for each country. But interestingly enough, national identity, at least measured in this way, when it comes to proximity people feel to their country, has not changed a whole lot at all during this time. Overall, you can see that overwhelming numbers of the population in many, many countries still think that they are, feel that they are very close or close to their country. And if you would look at national pride, the numbers look fairly similar. For example, if you look at the most recent data from Sweden on national pride, you would find that only 7% claim that they are not proud to be Swedish. Right. Now, you could, of course, question this and say, but perhaps what has happened over time is that national identities have weakened relative to other identities. Perhaps people have become more cosmopolitan at the same time as they also feel connected to their country. And here is another graph from our introduction showing you that this can't really be argued, because in most countries, the national identity remains the strongest one. Here you see how close people feel to, first, their city, secondly, their region, thirdly, their country, and fourthly, their continent, which is, of course, in most of these cases, Europe. And Great Britain, as you see here, stands out, so you can understand where Brexit was coming from when it comes to having a very low feeling of closeness to Europe. But the overall takeaway from this one is that the third bar, feeling close to your country, is by far the highest in most countries. And actually, this is especially the case in traditionally social democratic welfare states in Scandinavia, that is. Finally, you could, of course, also question who it is, which part of the population that are driving these numbers, which are, of course, averaged over the entire population. Perhaps, you could say, this is all driven, after all, by the people who sometimes are called the deplorables or the somewheres, and who might vote for populist parties and be strongly nationalistic in an exclusionary sense. And we say no, because here we've just very simply divided people into those who have a university degree and those who don't, which is the most typical demographic marker of whether or not people are a somewhere or an anywhere. And here you see that there is virtually no difference, and in some cases, even in some cases, it's even true that people with a university degree are slightly more willing to say that they're close to their country in, for example, Sweden, than people without a degree. But overall, the picture here is that this doesn't make a huge difference. So this is independently of people's education. So that's what I wanted to say about the persistence and perhaps surprising popularity of national identity, even among the highly educated. Now, moving on to my second point, my main argument here, to repeat, is that we need to take into account the multidimensional nature of national identity, and especially when studying the national identity argument, that is, the links between national identity and trust, among other things. Now, my overall take, and I'm not alone in this, but among political theorists, I'm slightly the odd one out, perhaps, in thinking of it like this, is that national identity is a form of social identity. And if we go to social psychology, Henri Tajfel, he defined them like this, that a social identity is that part of a person's self-concept that derives from the knowledge of his membership in a social group or groups, together with the value and emotional significance attached to the membership. So this social identity perspective on national identities leads political psychologists, and myself as well, to distinguish between different emotional aspects of national identity and to expect these to have effects on things like trust, quite apart from the normative content of the national identity. That is, again, whether or not it's mainly filled out by civic markers or ethnic markers, or as some would also say, cultural markers, a third category, which liberal nationalists tend to focus on. Now, there are not only psychological reasons to focus on other things than the civic ethnic content of the national identity. I think there are also normative reasons to do that. In an article I wrote a couple of years ago in Ethnicities, I tried to tease out in which way a liberal national identity is supposed to be thinner than a conservative one, and yet thicker than a civic patriotism type of identity. And my main conclusion there is that what makes a national identity liberal is that it allows for critique and dissent, and actually a change of the content of the national identity. So this means that even civic forms of national identity, say being very proud of your country's institutions rather than ethnicity or culture, can turn aggressive and exclusionary when there is a blind allegiance to whatever the national identity is seen to be. And this seems to be a particular risk in countries such as my own. And I will try to circle back to that towards the end of my talk. But I could say already here that there's research from Denmark by Danish colleagues showing that in the Nordic countries, civic patriotism is in fact linked to Islamophobia, whereas in most countries it's typically ethnic understandings of national identity that are linked to Islamophobia. So this might, of course, vary across countries. Now, I said different dimensions of national identity are important to distinguish for normative reasons, but also for empirical reasons. In a chapter I wrote in our edited volume, Liberal Nationalism and its Critics, I did a so-called CFA, a confirmatory factor analysis, which looks at the dimensionality of different attitudes, variables. And I could see that I used Dutch data, and I found a similar factor structure that is similar dimensions to what social psychologist Leonie Huddy and colleagues have previously found in the US, that it makes sense to distinguish between different dimensions of national identity, and that they have divergent effects on things like economic solidarity and what we are focusing here on, trust. And others have looked at how they focus on how they have different effects on political participation and also anti-immigrant attitudes. And these dimensions, you're probably wondering what they are, and I'm going to go into 4 of them, the main 4 as I understand them. And the ones we've used in this article on national identity and trust specifically, looking at Dutch and US data from EPSR. So the 4 ones that we work with are national attachment, national pride, national chauvinism, sometimes lumped together with uncritical patriotism, sometimes separated from it. And finally, the normative content of the national identity. And this is where the civic, ethnic, and cultural comes in. So beginning with the first one, national attachment and belonging is about feeling you're part of the country and feeling close to it, and you're co-nationals. So this is really about the degree to which a group identity resonates with your sense of self. I'll get back to this, but I've found, at least in my research, that this is mainly a benign form of national identity. Secondly, national pride. Here you could make further differentiations between a general pride, proud to be Swedish, proud to be Canadian, and a more specific pride, which is proud over certain achievements of the country. There's a whole battery of these questions that can sometimes be used. And there's, for example, how proud you are over your country's democracy, over its economic achievements. And there's also more cultural aspects like your country's history. And this is all about a specifically positive, of course, emotional identification with the nation. So national attachment is not per se positive. You could be attached to your country, but feel very ashamed of it, of course. So these are two different things. And then thirdly, national chauvinism is a sense of national superiority. Sometimes it's just called nationalism. And this terminology is sometimes very confusing because it's different in different disciplines. So this man behind me here, Isaiah Berlin, whom you might see in my bookshelf because I've worked a lot on him and his thought, he also used the word nationalism in this rather narrow sense for the bad version of it, for the inflamed version of it, more or less what I here call national chauvinism, and what psychologists tend to call national chauvinism, but some there call it nationalism as well. And this is about feeling nationally superior to others, which again is different from national attachment and national pride, because you could feel attached to your country, you could feel proud or ashamed of it, and yet at the same time not feel in any way superior to others. And uncritical patriotism, which could be separated out from national chauvinism, but sometimes correlates very strongly with it, is about whether or not you allow for critique of your country's symbols and authorities. And finally, you have the normative conceptions of the content of the national identity, which is where this focus on values comes in. Now, this dimension is typically seen as ranging between an exclusive ethnic understanding of the national identity based on blood and soil on the one hand, or at least blood, and at the very far end, on the other side of the spectrum, a civic understanding stressing citizenship and law-abidingness as a marker of national belonging, and culture, sharing cultural norms, speaking the language, etc., is often placed in between here. But all these are about different normative conceptions of what it takes to be a true co-national. And again, this is a cross-cutting dimension. So you could imagine being a civic, very strongly attached, very proud, and even chauvinistic person, despite having this quite inclusionary view of what the identity is about. Now, these dimensions, they do correlate in my data in the Netherlands and in the US, but they don't correlate very, very highly, actually. And that's especially the case for national chauvinism and national attachment, which correlate, for example, in my the data I used in the article I'm talking about at 0.27 in the Netherlands and only 0.12 in the US, which is a very low correlation. Which means that just because you feel attached to your country, it doesn't necessarily at all mean that you are equally chauvinistic and feel that your country is superior to others. Right, so what are the effects then, and why would any of these dimensions affect trust. In the article I mentioned, we try to talk about two mechanisms, and they're based on social identity theory. The first is perceived similarity. So from a number of experiments that social psychologists have done, we know that in the case of people we don't know and with whom we have no direct interactions, any sign of similarity with ourselves, whether accurate or not, tends to cue us to think that their behavior is more likely to be the same as our own than the behavior of someone who's more dissimilar to us. So the more we believe we have something in common with people, the more we tend to trust them, independently of how accurate this belief really is. And the second mechanism is positive in-group bias, because social identity theory posits not just that we search for a feeling of belonging to a group, but also that we want that group to reflect, of course, positively on ourselves. And at the same time, changing group is often emotionally and socially costly. So we tend to solve this conundrum by convincing ourselves that the group we already are in is already the best. So there's a strong tendency to evaluate other members of our in-group favorably, for example, in terms of trustworthiness. Now, we argue that national attachment, again, measured in terms of closeness and identification with the country, is a sign of feeling this shared social identity and should thus set these two processes in motion. Whereas for national chauvinism and national pride is slightly more complicated, because national chauvinism, if we begin with that, is not really a sign of in-group connectedness, but of, again, superiority, even hubris and disdain for other groups. And you could very well hate others without loving your own. Many would even say that that's quite a good characteristic of some Trump supporters, for example. And national pride is more ambivalent. On the one hand, you could see it as a sign of connection to a shared social identity, and thus something that should be benign and lead to trust. But at the same time, Leonie Hadi and her colleague Alessandro Del Ponte show in a chapter in our book, for example, that national pride can also be the result of a defense mechanism in response to threat or competition. And then it can become very aggressive and malignant. And this is what essentially also what Isaiah Berlin wrote about in more theoretical terms when he talked about the bent twig nationalism, a nationalism that flames up and becomes aggressive towards anyone who insults it. Now, the main findings from our study of this in the EPSR article is that national attachment is indeed something that correlates strongly with trust. It heightens both social and political trust, but especially political trust. National chauvinism, measured by, for example, agreement to the idea that my country is better than others, has the opposite effect. It's the erosive side of national identity. It correlates with lower social trust in both the Netherlands and the US, and also with lower political trust in the Netherlands. Finally, national pride is and remains more ambiguous. It's not the clear-cut villain it's sometimes made out to be, but nor is it entirely unproblematic. We find that it heightens political trust in the institutions, that is, in both countries, and also, in fact, social trust in the Netherlands, but in the US, it lowers social trust. So that was my second point, which was about the different dimensions of national identity and how important it really is to separate between them when especially looking at how they might affect trust. And now let's delve into my third point, which is to complicate matters when looking more specifically at immigrants and immigrants' descendants, sometimes called second-generation immigrants, but I think that label is quite problematic because we're talking about people who are born, in this case, in Denmark, but who have immigrant parents. So now I'm going to talk a bit about some results from another piece I wrote with the Danish colleague I've already mentioned, Karen Breidal, with whom I have an ongoing project that I'll go into in a minute. And we looked at the relationship between national identity and trust among immigrants and their descendants in Denmark. Because we know virtually nothing about this this question. It's quite interesting how all the studies that have looked at national identity and trust have focused on the national identity and feelings towards it of the ethnic majority in a country and trust, or sometimes the perceptions among the majority of whether or not the immigrants are loyal to the country, whether or not they have a strong national identity, and how that, for example, affects trust. But what we want to look at here is the immigrants and their descendants, their own views of Danishness and whether or not they feel connected to it and proud of it, etc. These groups, as you know, are often at the heart of the debates in which national identity is recommended as a sort of cohesion booster. And of course, it's important to know whether or not this works for immigrants as well. If a national identity is really to perform as a common in-group identity, able to overcome cultural and ethnic divisions, which is the idea for liberal nationalists, it's not enough for it to perform that role, I think, for the native majority. Because if it doesn't do that for immigrants, there is a risk that by emphasizing national identity, we end up with an even larger gap than we already have between the very groups that were meant to be brought together by sharing this identity, the sort of natives and immigrant descendants. Now, by looking at Denmark, we're looking at, in many ways, an extreme case. For the last 2 decades, the public debate in Denmark has been rife with concerns that immigrants and their descendants are unwilling to take part in society, untrustworthy, also have low trust themselves, and do not share supposedly Danish values, such as commitment to democracy, gender equality, and gay rights. So consequently, the importance of sharing so-called Danish values has become a prominent feature in public debates in immigrant integration. So we ask in this article, how do different aspects of national identity among immigrants and their descendants in such an extreme setting relate to trust of different types? And we also ask if there is a link between national identity among immigrants here and trust. Is it driven by simply feeling connected to this identity, even in the absence of sharing values, which is what social identity theory posits and which is what I myself tend to believe? Or is this link driven by sharing values? So our main findings is first that feeling identification with Denmark for immigrants and descendants of immigrants does here come with higher trust in natives, native Danes, and also higher trust in other immigrants. It does not actually seem to affect general social trust. And this is potentially a problem, but you could also argue that general social trust, which is typically measured with the question, most people can be trusted, is something that is rather close to a personality trait, and something that tends to change only very, very slowly over a lifetime. So it might be that getting a stronger shared identity, such as the national one, might not affect that type of very tenacious personality trait. At least that's what Erik Juslainer argues about trust, the general trust measure. Now, we also see that national pride, feeling proud of to be Danish, comes with higher political trust among the immigrants and immigrant descendants we're looking at here. And finally, and this is what I think is most interesting from my point of view, these relationships are not driven by sharing or perceiving that one shares sort of national values. I would call this the shallow identity thesis. In other words, we see that the extent to which someone identifies with Denmark, the extent to which someone is proud to be Danish, has a positive relationship with their trust, even in the absence of sharing national values and perceiving that one shares Danish values with Danes. And this, I think, matters policy-wise as well. It's not only of academic interest, because it is, of course, one thing to promote shared national values, for example, by value contracts or national curricula in schools stressing these values. And it is quite another to promote a shared feeling of national pride in or belonging to the nation. The latter are things that you could promote by shared national holidays, national symbols, or sports events, which might be able to bring people together, despite vast differences in values. And sometimes debates and policies designed to further shared values may even undermine the sharing of an identity and taking pride in it. I think that the Muhammad cartoons affair in Denmark, or the veil ban discussions France has seen over the last 20 years, are good examples of that, where there has been a discourse stressing the importance of supposedly sharing supposedly Danish or French values of secularism, not least. But because these values have been presented as largely incompatible with being Muslim, they might have undermined the sense of shared national identity for some Muslims in France and Denmark, respectively. So that was what I wanted to say about the link between national identity and trust among immigrants and immigrants' descendants. But at this point, it might be that you think, now, is there no negative side to national identification and national pride? It sounds like she wants to make the case that they're all very nice and rosy and positive, and as long as we steer clear of national chauvinism, we don't have to worry about the negative aspects of a national identity. And of course, that's not really what I want to say. So I want to complicate the picture further by bringing in my own country and my recent research on what happened in Sweden during the pandemic and how national identity played out then. And I'm going to talk now a bit about the results from a recent article from this year, rallying around the unwaved flag that I authored together with a colleague in Uppsala. As you might remember, although we now everyone try to forget about the pandemic, and we're very happy to not think about it anymore for understandable reasons. But you might remember that Sweden chose its own path during the pandemic, and the puzzle that we're addressing is that Sweden's individualistic and so-called trust-based COVID approach, which was to not lock down and to rely very much on people's individual judgment. That approach has been very popular among Swedes, despite a death toll that has been rather high. There are always discussions about how to measure this, and those who want to defend Sweden bring out excess mortality. But if you just look at deaths per capita in COVID overall, this graph only shows you most of 2020. And the reason I'm showing you that is that the data we have is sort of right after, it's gathered right after this time period. But overall, if you look at Sweden during the pandemic, we have had about 5 times as many deaths per capita as neighboring Norway, twice as many as neighboring Denmark, countries that we tend to be very similar to in other regards. And yet this approach has been very popular. So we ask why. I don't have to go into maybe how popular it's been, but one just to give you a view of the relative popularity of it, is that in June 2020, Swedes were the least critical of all Europeans regarding how their country handled the pandemic. At that point, only 8% of the Swedes believed that the country had handled the crisis very poorly. And this placed us Swedes on par with South Koreans, where the total death toll at that time was 5 times smaller per capita. Now, what explains this? Now, I was in Sweden for half of the pandemic, and then I sort of fled to the UK to some extent. But I was there long enough to see some anecdotal evidence, at least, that national identity did play a role in all this. We had a state epidemiologist who was compared by many to the national soul incarnated. That's the lowest, that's the main headline down on the right. And Jens Liljestrand, who wrote about that, he is a clear and very open anti-nationalist. So this is a very progressive, non-nationalist person who in other situations is very non-nationalistic. But yet he compared the state epidemiologist who symbolized Sweden's approach to the national soul. Others said he was our guide to the galaxy, or that he was like the hero in an adventure movie. And he was also compared to this pivotal figure in Swedish history, Axel Oxenstierna, which is the man you see next to him in the 17th century outfit. And that was from, of course, pre-democratic times, when Axel Oxenstierna sort of made sure that Sweden was a great power in the 1600s, which was when Sweden was at its largest and most was seen as a superpower in Europe. Right. So the Swedish COVID narrative, we argue in this article, basically was narrated as an embodiment of the COVID approach was narrated as an embodiment of the 3 main sources of national institutional pride among the Swedes. And these are rationality and science, democracy, and finally the economy. The Swedish approach was seen as more rational. It was narrated as the opposite of panicking, the opposite of being hysterical. The Swedish approach was narrated as being the democratic response. Lockdowns were sometimes translated in a way that made them sound extremely anti-authoritarian. Often cases that were extreme were brought up as China, and lockdowns were seen as something that were incompatible with Swedish democracy. And some argued that the Swedish approach of relying on individual responsibility was essentially what being Swedish is. And finally, there was this idea that the Swedish way of handling COVID was to prioritize the economy over health, and making sure that society continued as much as possible, as normal, and that there would be as few interruptions as possible. Of course, there were lots of interruptions and people did take precautions. I'm not arguing that people didn't do anything, but by international comparison, of course, Sweden did less. So what happens then when what a country does is frowned upon and increasingly criticized by the rest of the world, and at the same time nationally within that country, it is narrated as something that goes to the core of that country's identity? Well, of course, any alternative strategies become threatening, become a threat to the national identity and to the national status. So we use Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism, which is what the unwaved flag is all about. And as you see here, it's not only me, but others, media studies, who have concluded that there was a burst of nationalism in the media during this time, and that the most common storyline was that there was a pressure on Sweden from the outside to defend itself. So critique of the Swedish strategy was seen as a threat to the national status, and sometimes connected to actual international threats, such as Russian troll factories, anti-democratic forces, and disinformation online. And all this led me and my colleague to say, let's do a survey on this, as if that were the only response to anything. But let's measure people's views on these different dimensions of national identity and the extent to which they defend the Swedish strategy, to which extent they support it. And building on rally around the flag theory, we argue here that there should be certain of these dimensions that lead people to support the Swedish strategy as a sort of defense mechanism, but others won't. And indeed, we find that national pride, national chauvinism, and uncritical patriotism, remember this dimension about not wanting your national symbols or authorities to be criticized, they all are very strongly related to support for the Swedish strategy and support for a general anti-lockdown narrative that we've measured. And they explain these outcomes much better than general trust does, or being individualistic, which are the typical other explanations used sometimes to defend the Swedish approach. But we also find that national attachment does not explain popular support for the Swedish strategy, and the content of the national identity doesn't do so either. So all in all, our conclusion here, you can see the main picture here, is that in the case of the pandemic, there was this rather weird situation where a state epidemiologist and his institutions, the institutions of modern day Sweden, became nationalized. They became national symbols, especially when what they recommended was attacked by international media, but also international experts, and increasingly questioned. And the whole image of Sweden was questioned internationally. And this led to sort of inflamed nationalism, which I think is rather well illustrated by this picture, because here you have the ultimate symbol of a progressive, maybe environmentally friendly, probably also a gender neutral thing, like the tote bag. And yet, in this case, you could actually buy these tote bags during the pandemic. It nevertheless gets combined with this rather aggressive type of nationalism by showing this funny picture of state epidemiologist Tegnell as Rambo with this huge blazing Swedish flag behind him. And now, to finish this off, I will tell you a little bit about my ongoing research, which is not yet published or ready, that these debates, not least in the pandemic, have led me to. So I have this project that I've recently started due to, not least, the baby I told you about. We've started a bit later than we should, so we'll be continuing this for a couple of years, and we call it Nationhood in a Pandemic, Nordic Gold or Nordic Noir. And in it, we look at the interplay between national identity, political trust, and also effective polarization and attitudes to immigrants in Denmark and Sweden. Now, there are anecdotal reasons, at least, to fear that, at least in the case of Sweden, and it seems, or perhaps also in the case of Denmark, but what I know is the case of Sweden, immigrants became the scapegoat when the national identity was at stake in terms of the pandemic. Here, just a couple of pictures showing you how immigrants were mentioned during these debates. On the left, you see a tweet which quotes the state epidemiologist when he was asked about masks, which were very contentious for a long time in Sweden, and there was no recommendation on masks, and people who were wearing masks could also be met with quite a lot of ridicule, if not violence. And at the time when he was asked about whether or not we measure mask wearing from an official point of view, it was well known that immigrants and people of immigrant descent tended to wear more masks than people who were native-born Swedes. And at that time, he then said, we don't measure mask wearing as a government. From personal observation, we don't see many Swedes wearing masks at all. The only people I've seen wearing masks in public look like tourists. And this is quite an interesting case of, probably subconsciously, of course, I'm not saying this is deliberate, but still an othering of the almost more than 20% of the population in Sweden who may not look Swedish to Tegnell, but who are certainly Swedish and who, to a greater extent than native-born Swedes, were wearing masks at the time. And tourists were not very likely in Sweden overall at the time of December 2020, in the middle of the second wave of the pandemic, I should add. There's also the case of the mentor of Tegnell and the Public Health Agency, Professor Johan Giesecke, who was asked early on in April 2020 already in an interview on Unheard about the Swedish approach and why there were at that time quite a lot of deaths in the elderly care. And he then responded that this was due to immigrants and asylum seekers working in these nursing homes and their language deficiencies. So the idea that he propounded was that they did not understand the guidelines well enough because of language problems and therefore did not follow the guidelines, and therefore the disease spread. Later on, of course, it became more and more clear that the guidelines were quite faulty because the guidelines were about washing hands, not wearing masks. This was never taken back as a statement from him. And finally, you have an interview, and now we're talking about the end of 2020, when it's becoming clear that over the year, Sweden did rather poorly in COVID terms in comparison to neighboring countries. And in the national news, finally, I would say, from my personal point of view, there was a critical discussion of this, and Tegnell was forced to answer why Sweden fared so poorly. And there he responded, it's immigrants that have been the driving force in many countries, and Sweden has more of those than the neighboring countries. He was criticized for this, and he actually sort of took back the formulation that immigrants had been a driving force, but there was no clear taking back of the main reasoning behind this claim, which was that somehow having more immigrants would necessarily translate into more COVID deaths. And so we looked at this in our survey as well, and I'm just going to show you preliminarily what we found. We found that among Swedes, this is a politically representative sample of Swedes of about 2,000 people, it's quite common to blame immigrants' own behavior for their vulnerability to COVID-19. Because in Sweden, as in most countries, immigrant communities were hit much harder by COVID than native Swedes. And so the question is why? And here you see that people tend to agree that this is because immigrants have closer social contacts and socialize more across generational boundaries. They also tend to agree with Giesecke's statement that they do not understand the recommendations due to deficient Swedish, and that would be a reason. And 60% agree that it's because this is the final variable. They are not following the recommendations from the authorities. Whereas fewer people agree that this is because immigrants have jobs where they are more exposed to infection. So more typical structural explanations that you might perhaps expect in a welfare state, that people would have these structural explanations. But in fact, they tend to blame immigrants' own behavior more. And in addition, close to half of our respondents, 45%, believe that the reason that the elderly care or nursing homes were hit so hard by COVID was, as Giesecke put it, that the staff has difficulties with the Swedish language. So this was a common perception, not only among people who talked in media, but also among ordinary Swedes. And now what we did very, very simply here, we collapsed these questions into an index we call Blame Immigrant Index. And then we just looked at the relationships between our different dimensions of national identity, controlling for background variables like class and age and education and gender, etc. And this outcome, blaming immigrants. And here we see a slightly more complicated picture. So we see that national chauvinism, quite as we would expect, has makes people more likely to blame immigrants. That's not very unexpected. National pride does not have a significant effect on this outcome. Having an ethnic understanding of the nation also has a negative effect. A positive effect, meaning that you tend to blame immigrants more if you have an ethnic understanding of the nation. But having a civic understanding of the nation, I'm sorry it's called civicness on this graph, I should have changed it, because this is essentially whether or not people think that in order to be Swedish, you need to follow the law, the Swedish law and Swedish institutions. And having this civic understanding of the nationhood is, in fact, the best explanation we have here of blaming immigrants. So here we see some reason, at least, to be cautious even of a civic national identity, because having this civic understanding of a national identity has the strongest impact on blaming immigrants. This coefficient is almost twice the size of the other variables and accounts for more of the explained variance than any other explanatory variable we've included. Right. But as you see, on the other hand, institutional national pride, being very proud of Swedish institutions, makes you less likely to blame immigrants, and uncritical patriotism also makes you less likely. So the picture is I'm not sure I can make sense of all this at this time. And finally, national attachment, again, has no significant effect either way. So at least national attachment, again, is not the bad guy, so to speak. Right. I'm getting very close now to summing up. So what I've tried to convey here is first that national identity is persistent and powerful, so it cannot be escaped whether we want it or not. Secondly, that there are several dimensions of it, and some dimensions of it, above all national attachment, seem to boost trust without at the same time having any very problematic effects on inclusion of immigrants. Whereas other dimensions, like national chauvinism, seem to erode trust and, as we saw here towards the end, also have very problematic effects on views on immigrants, at least in the pandemic in Sweden. When it comes to immigrants' own experience of the national identity of their new country, is in the case of Denmark, it's even more complex. But again, some form of identification with the new country seems to boost trust across groups, so that immigrants and descendants of immigrants who feel more connected to Denmark also trust native Danes more, all else being equal. So here I should also add we controlled for feeling of discrimination, etc. So this is not driven by people feeling that you could say that oh, this is people who feel fairly treated by Danish society, and that's what's making them both feel more proud to be Danish, feel more identity with Denmark, and to trust native Danes. But that's not the case. We've sort of held constant that effect. So this is something beyond a lack of discrimination. Fourthly, I just wanted to circle back to this important insight that trust, which I've until very long into my talk at least, I was constantly assuming it's a good thing. We should also, I think, recognize that it's not always good for democracy. It can become blind, it can become uncritical. And here, Patty, as I mentioned, Patty Leonard has written on this, and also Honora O'Neill and Pippa Norris. But I think we also need to recognize when we discuss that this blind allegiance risk with trust can play out in a specifically pernicious way when it comes to immigrants, in the sense that a high trusting group, especially, and this is my last point, if trust is built into the national identity, as it often is in civic national identities, and as I've tried to argue, it is in the Swedish case, this idea that, oh, it's very Swedish to trust others, and immigrants are different because they trust people less, which is in fact empirically true. But when you connect trust in this way to the national identity, then it can, of course, become especially exclusionary. And especially when you have a large-scale national crisis, such as the pandemic, and when the national identity is perceived to be under pressure and having to defend itself against threats. So that was a word of general caution, and I hope I've been clear about what is sort of research that is published and out there, and these last few slides and ideas, which are from ongoing research, which I'm hoping to work on over the next few years, which also means that I am especially keen to hear your comments and questions, so I can incorporate those into my my work in the future. So thank you so much for listening.
Can you hear me, Gina? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for the talk. We have about 20 minutes for discussion and questions. We said we would operate a hand-finger system, so if you have a question, you raise a hand. If you have a follow-up for a question, you raise a finger, so I know that you're a little bit further down the queue. Okay, Anna-Marie is first.
Yeah, hi Gina, it's Anna-Marie from Tromsø.
Yeah.
Thanks for another excellent talk and presentation. Very much enjoyed it. I have two questions which relate mainly to your new project, which I think is really interesting and seems like a really worthwhile thing to do. So one question about the generalizability of your argument, and another question about what kind of role the sort of basis or grounds for distrusting things play for your argument. So, so if I understand you correctly, what you are saying is that sometimes if trust and trusting institutions, policies, laws of the nation, and so on and so forth, they become an integral element of what national identity is about, then that might sometimes turn very nasty and hostile, exclusionary of those groups of people who, for whatever reason, are not equally trusting of institutions and policies and so on and so forth. And your example here, of course, is immigrants. And in the Swedish pandemic case, we can see how that played out. My question about the generalizability of the point has to do with the fact that it seems that, yes, immigrants is a very interesting case, but it seems that it could be applied to any group whatsoever that for whatever reason is not equally trusting the general political institutions, policies, and so on and so forth. So for example, indigenous peoples, LGBTIQ persons, perhaps certain populistic movements, flat earthers, people who think that the elite is eating babies behind the pizza restaurants or something like that. Whatever kind of grounds they have, they are distrustful in comparison to the majority population. So I guess the question here is that whether you think that the case of immigrants is somehow special, or whether this could be equally applied to all sorts of other groups. So that's the first question. And the second question, which I think relates to this, is about the kinds of the role of the grounds for being distrustful, what kind of role that plays for you. So it seems to me that there are better grounds for being distrustful in some cases and worse grounds to being distrustful. So in certain cases, we might think that, for example, the immigrants who were distrustful or suspicious of the Swedish policy probably had very good grounds to being so. And we would think that that's a good thing. Whereas, for example, flat earthers or people who think that elite eats babies, people might not have good grounds for being distrustful. And we might think that this is not the kind of vigilance towards institutions and policies and so on and so forth that would be beneficial in democracy. So I'm just wondering how what kind of role either the kinds of good grounds for being distrustful or not good grounds for being distrustful play for your case.
Those are both excellent points. About the generalizability, I'm not sure I would say that immigrants are in fact special, because as we all know, when national identity becomes nasty and defensive and aggressive, then it also tends to become rather exclusionary when it comes to other groups, such as, for example, being connected to a very male or very heterosexual understanding of what it is to be a good citizen. And in fact, in my more popular, not research based, but more popular book on this in Sweden, I have a few examples of how the so-called big dick energy, actually, of Anders Tegnell was brought out in the debate, and how his critics were sometimes narrated as being men who were slightly too feminine or too hysterical, and the women who were critical were often criticized for being shrill in their tone and again being hysterical. So there was certainly a gendered and perhaps even a sexual aspect to the symbol of national identity in this case. So I don't think immigrants are necessarily the only group who are relevant here. And when it comes to the role of distrust, of course, or the role of the grounds for distrust, that I think is the big difference between distrust and mistrust, and that's a good reason why we should try to distinguish between those two things. Often it's instead the case that people look at trust and then say that the opposite of trust is just lack of trust, and then that means you lump together people who have conspiracy theories and who don't, in a way, think critically, but who very much trust their own alternative sources of information, with people who just have a more critical approach to anyone, including their own institutions and authorities, and who have the idea that you have to be vigilant. Vigilance is the main focus of Pippa Norris, for example, in her new book about how we should be critical and distrust, but not mistrust, which is just having a general preconception that, oh, these people or these authorities are lying to us and we're sure of it, and we're not going to evaluate their actions because we know it already. But I think the grounds for distrust, yeah, that's something I should probably think more about, that comment. Thank you, Anna-Marie.
Thanks. Niels Haltag from University of Copenhagen. Hi, Gina.
Hi, Niels.
So I have I guess, a clarificatory question and a comment, both pertaining to your claim that the effects of national identity are apart from or independent of the content of that identity. So the clarificatory question is about, so I take it that you're not denying that normative content may or values may have an impact on various aspects of social cohesion. You're just saying that it's not part of the impact of the national identity or sharing an identity, although there may be a sort of secondary or independent impact of particular values. So that's a clarificatory question. The more substantive question, I guess, is, so I guess in a way I would find it surprising if there was kind of an effect that was independent of the content of national identities, just because, so suppose you have a national identity that's based on values such as short-term egoism, lack of faith in dialogue and democracy and so on. So, this is how I perceive myself, this is how I perceive other people in my community. And so knowing that, like myself, other people are short-term egoists, presumably would not increase my trust in them, because I know that being short-term egoists, they might, whenever they've made a promise, but saw that they had an advantage in not keeping it, they would have an incentive to not to keep it, and so on. So it just seemed very surprising to me if there was an effect that was independent of the content of that identity.
I see. So the second point makes me think of this study. I don't remember who wrote it, but there's the study of Palermitans, people in Palermo in Sicily, where apparently people trust, Sicilians and Palermitans, I think, they tend to trust their own people, in the sense that their own people are from their own city the least, and then they trust Sicilians slightly more, but still very little, and then they trust Italians overall a little bit more, but still rather little, and then other Europeans, they trust them the most, sort of. So they have this idea that their own themselves and people from their own community are not trustworthy. Yeah, but as I understand this idea that the effects of a national identity on trust would be dependent on sharing values. Of course, it's what should I say? That claim is about sharing something else than just your view of whether or not people are trustworthy, I take it. It's often understood to be about sharing the values such as democracy or liberal views on gay rights or secularism, those sort of things that people tend to think that immigrants don't share to the extent that they should. And so that's what we're looking at here. But of course, I can't say that particular aspect of the national entity, which has to do with the outcome here, namely trust, whether or not you think people are trustworthy, that wouldn't matter at all. But that, I think, is a more specific claim than the more typical claim that the values sharing the content of a national identity in terms of some sort of national values is what really drives the boosting side of national identity. And yes, and then your first question, the clarificatory one, yes, I don't exactly remember what we find in that article, but our main argument is not that it's not important, at least for us, that the content aspect would have no impact on trust. What's important is that the links we find from feeling more attached to the country or more proud of it to trust, that those links are, yes, they're they're not dependent on sharing values. So those links don't disappear when you control for the question of shared values, because that's how I've understood the social identity theory perspective, which is that you can have a very shallow shared identity, and if you increase that, if you feel closer to the people who share this very shallow identity, then that should also set in motion this process of becoming more trusting of other people in that in-group.
We have about 6 minutes left and 3 people. So maybe we group together the next two. So Volker is first and then Ott.
Okay, thank you, Kina. So you know, hi. I'm very much in favor as a few political theorists, I'm very much in favor of your psychological emotional understanding of national identity. But at the same time, I realized that our psychology and our emotions, right, they are not free floating. They are somehow dependent on the world, right? And now you said that that what we should get to is something like more of national attachment, because it's kind of increasing trust, and less towards national pride and chauvinism, because that is going to decrease trust, right? Now, my question would be, now it's really a curiosity question. Now, how could we go about to get more attachment and less pride and chauvinism? How could we do that?
That is the million-dollar question, right? So I don't have a good scientific answer, since I don't know, but a step in this process is that I want to know what it does to us to see national symbols of different kinds. Because as you know, Michael Billig's idea of banal nationalism is that we are constantly surrounded by these cues that remind us of our shared national identity. There's when we talk about the weather, we think about the national weather. We talk about the news, the football. I mean, it's all typically national. And then we have the more obvious symbols of flags, which differ across national context in the extent to which they are banal, because in some contexts, like the UK, the national flag is quite contentious and politicized. But in my context of Sweden, the Swedish flag is certainly placed in a lot of situations where people barely see it. For example, when you go to the hospital and have a baby, you get a tray afterwards with sandwiches and a flag on it, a Swedish flag on it. And that when you mention that to people, they say, "Oh, right, that's true, but I never thought of it as a symbol of the nation. Oh, it's just it doesn't mean anything." And so what we want to do in this new experiment that we're actually about to run right now in Sweden and Denmark is to expose people to flags. And this has been done in other contexts, but not in the Nordic countries. And we're doing it in Sweden and Denmark. And we're trying to see, we want to see which of these dimensions they prime. And we also expose people to pictures of national landscapes, which has been done in Austria, but never anywhere else as far as I know. And in the Austrian study, they actually show that when people are, when people see their own national landscapes, in that case, the Alps, it did increase their national attachment, but not their national pride. Whereas when they saw the flag, it increased both. So that's one, of course, very specific case where you see that different types of national symbols could prime and spark different different dimensions of national identity. But of course, that is the big question. How do you enhance the good sides without at the same time enhancing the bad sides? Certainly.
So we have Salt, and then we try to take.
Oh, sorry,
Carolyn's
we were
as
going to
well.
put them together. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but we still have to do that. So
Yeah.
Salt and then Carolyn.
Hi, thanks. It's Jolt from Tromsø.
Hi, Jolt.
I'm actually glad for that answer, because it helps me ask my question, because I find this idea of shallow identity, or this attachment without the value component, really interesting. But kind of my instinct would be to question if it really is so free floating or not value laden for two reasons. One is that there are always kind of, it's not just symbols that are circulating, but national narratives and value statements attached to them. And so you might not reflect on it, but when you feel you're attached to your country, that kind of always implicitly involves a conception of your country. So that would be one idea, and the other idea could be that these supposedly neutral symbols and things like that, they embody values just because of their history and everything, even if you're not aware of it, right? So it might be that it doesn't mean anything to me, but it does mean something sort of socially or in the context of our history and things like that. So I'm wondering if there really is this kind of category of attachment without value or shallow attachment, shallow identity. Yeah, what do you think about that? Thank you.
Carolyn, can you just pass it?
Thank you. I'm Carolyn McLeod from Western University. I want to follow up about national attachment and relationship to trust. So you want to make the point that national attachment or belonging boosts trust, and I wonder if that's really the right way to put it, because I think trust is actually necessary for attachment and belonging. That's something I'm going to talk about later in this conference. So maybe the right way to put it is that trust goes along with that attachment and belonging, but doesn't boost it. And I think it's important to make that point, because what you're suggesting is that, already feeling attached or a sense of belonging is almost a requirement for trust, for having that social trust. But, arguably the direction goes in the other direction, that having some sense of trust is required for attachment or belonging. Anyway, I wonder what you think about that.
Excellent. I'll start with this last comment. Thank you. I do actually think that that the relationship goes. I'm sure there is relationship going in both directions, but since there are quite a few experimental studies where people are primed with national identity in the US, in Malawi, in India, for example, in Austria also, and then the effects on trust of that experimental prime are gauged, and they find that there is a relationship. I would argue that the relationship goes in that direction, but of course, I'm sure you could also probably find links in the opposite direction. So I'm sure there is that too. But then also there is also another reason that I would say I would place identity first, namely that trust, if you bar the question of generalized trust, which is so close to a personality trait that it almost doesn't make any sense. But if you look more at these trusting institutions, for example, that vary across time and for most people at least are not set in stone, but depend on where they are and what they think of those institutions, then identity should be something more important and more and slightly less malleable than their trust. So it would make sense for identity to affect trust more than vice versa. But I'm sure there are links in the opposite direction too. But feel free to send me your talk or your paper, then I will definitely look into that as well. And then Rolf's comment, yes, thank you for that. I think I need to think about how to. Yeah, I'm not clear in my head, I think, and I also should think about how to formulate it more clearly. But I don't want to say that there is something like national attachment, which is entirely independent of the content of the national identity, because that wouldn't make any sense. Because of course you want to know, what are people attached to? So rather, I want to say that these are two independent dimensions. Namely, you could be more or less attached to either a civic identity or an ethnic identity or a cultural identity, and the effect of the attachment is one thing, and the effect on trust, for example, and the effect of the content is another thing. A bit like you could be you could be a very strongly politically engaged person, and let's say you're engaged, you could be engaged in the environmental movement or the LGBTQ movement, or you could be a raging Tory, or you could be, so the content of course matters, but your actual level of engagement might also matter on its own. So that's the way to think about it. Yes, I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. We're at the end of the first keynote. Thanks again for joining us all the way from Sweden.
Oh, thank you for your comments. Thank you for having me. I wish I could be there.
And we have a break now of about 12 minutes. And then we'll return for the first panel session.
All right, we have three 15-minute presentations, and we'll take questions at the end of them. So firstly here we have Niels Holtug from the University of Copenhagen on do shared values promote trust?
You hear me? Okay. Thanks. So what I'll be doing here is in a way something a bit different from what Gina just did. So where she focused on national identities independently of their content, I'm very much going to be focusing on content and on values, and in particular on shared values. Much of what I say derives from this book, which came out about 1.5 years ago. I do say something extra today. So it's not just a representation of it, but if you're interested, this is where you can read more. So according to one influential argument, right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so according to this influential argument, sharing an identity in a group or a community tends to facilitate social trust or various dimensions of trust. So this is an argument made by social scientists, political theorists, but also found in public debates, and policies are developed on the basis of this idea, and so on, as Gina also said. Now, often such an identity is specified as a set of values. And as seen various countries do this, trying to find out what the national identity is, identifying national values, and so on. But there's a question here about which political theorists disagree about, namely, insofar as shared values do promote trust and other aspects of social cohesion, such as solidarity, I'll be concerned with both. There's a question about what kind of values tend to promote trust and other aspects of social cohesion. And that's the question I'll be going into here. So, so this is a study I did with some colleagues. It's a Danish study. Gina also referred to it, where we, on the basis of a bunch of value questions, we grouped respondents into 4 different groups, which we call conservative nationalists, liberals, and multiculturalists. And then we looked at relations between belonging to one of these groups and levels of trust and solidarity. And we had 6 different measures of trust and solidarity. We had trust in Danes, trust in strangers, trust in immigrants. And then, I guess you can't really see that because of the screen. We had a measure of general solidarity. We had a measure of solidarity with the worse off. And we had a measure of solidarity with immigrants, where solidarity was operationalized as support for redistribution. And what we found was that in the case of the 2 nationalisms, there were no positive relations between belonging to one of these groups and our measures of trust and solidarity. And in some cases, there were negative relations, in particular regarding trust in and solidarity without groups or immigrants. But what I want to focus on today is sort of the cases in which we found positive relations, namely for liberalism and multiculturalism. So what we found was that liberals tend to have more trust in strangers, more trust in immigrants, and more solidarity with immigrants. And so in these ways to be more inclusive regarding outgroups. And multiculturalists we found had there were positive correlations to all the 6 measures of trust and solidarity. So multiculturalists were more trusting of Danes, strangers, immigrants. They had high levels of general solidarity and solidarity with the worse off and solidarity with immigrants. And what I want to focus on today, or speculate, it's a bit speculative. What I want to discuss is how might we explain these positive impacts of certain values. I should say that what we found are, of course, just correlations. So there's a question here about the direction of causality. I think it's plausible, and there's also some indication of that the causality goes both ways, so that there's both an impact of values on trust and solidarity, and also the other way around. So the first question, or one question, is this basically about values, or is it about sharing values? So insofar as these liberal and multicultural values have a positive impact, is this due to the nature of these values, or is it due to these values being shared in the community, or is it somehow due to both of these things? We also looked at, we also had a question about the extent to which people thought that their values were shared with other members of their community. And so we were able to look at whether liberals and multiculturalists who believe that they share their values with other Danes have higher levels of trust and solidarity. And in general, we found that that was not the case. There seemed to be no relation between believing that other people in the community shared your values and having higher levels of trust and solidarity. And a bit surprisingly, in some cases, we found that believing that other people in your community share your values was correlated to lower trust and solidarity. So that was a bit surprising. We do have a potential explanation of that, which we can come back to during questions if there's an interest for it. But at least it was a surprising result for us. So why might shared values or values have an impact on trust and solidarity? So here are 4 different possible explanations. Shared values might facilitate identification with other members of your community, which may create an emotional attachment that promotes trust and solidarity. So that's kind of the explanation that is often given for the national identity argument that Gina was presenting, and which relates to social identity theory. Another possible explanation is that shared values in the community give rise to a sense of common aims, a sense of being in it together, which may promote trust and solidarity in the group. So it's not really about identifying with other members of the group, but it's seeing oneself as someone who has a common project with other members of the group. It might be about not liberal values, but liberal institutions. I'm just going to mention that and not really go into it. And then finally, another explanation might be that liberal or multicultural values express an inclusive attitude towards other people. So insofar as you have liberal and multicultural values, you're going to be more likely to see other people as your equals, for whom you're willing to and be more willing to include them in your in-group, which may predict other inclusive attitudes towards them, including trust and solidarity. So this last explanation is about values. It's about the nature of values, whereas the other explanations, to some extent at least, are about sharing values. But if we look at these other explanations, they don't really explain why particular values might be more conducive to social cohesion than others. So if it's just about identification, for instance, then it's just about having the same values as other members of your community, which wouldn't explain why people who have liberal and multicultural values might have stronger trust and high levels of solidarity with other members of the group. In the case of liberal values, what we found was that they're correlated to trust in and solidarity with outgroups, right? So this may suggest that it's kind of a boundary effect, an effect of boundary drawing, including strangers and immigrants within the community, to which trust and solidarity is extended. So people with liberal values think of other people as their equals, and they're more inclined to include other people in their in-group than people who have certain other attitudes are. That would be the basic explanation. Multicultural values, like liberal values, they can be said to express an inclusive attitude towards minorities, and perhaps even more so. So multiculturalists, for instance, might be willing to extend minority rights to people or group differentiated rights to people, which expresses positive attitudes and inclusive attitude towards them, which may lead to inclusion in the community to which then solidarity is extended. So that again would be an effect of boundary drawing. But multicultural values we found are also correlated to solidarity and trust in the in-group. So it's not just about, apparently not just about boundary drawing. Multiculturalists also tend to have more trust in and solidarity with the group. And this is my last slide. How might we explain that? So I want to distinguish between what I call scope effects and strength effects. Scope effects consist in a mechanism that includes former outgroup members in the in-group, and on this basis increases positive attitudes towards these members. Strength effects consist in a mechanism that increases positive attitudes to members of the in-group. So how might that come about? And here's sort of two possible explanations. So according to the first explanation, the in-group is not simply a differentiated mass that consists of members who may be more or less prototypical in the group. So they may be closer to the core of the group or more on the boundary, closer to the boundary. Some values may lead to a relaxation of criteria for closeness to prototypical members, such that it becomes easier for all members to obtain the full benefit of in-group membership. So there's the idea would be that that's kind of a relaxing of the significance of being a prototypical member or being a member who's closer to the boundary of the group. And that the effect of this would be to extend higher levels of trust and solidarity even to members who are closer to the boundary of the group. The other mechanism is that is more undifferentiated. Some values may tend to boost positive attitudes to in-group members quite generally, because of the kind of values they are. They express a positive, optimistic, inclusive, and egalitarian attitude towards other people in general. And then people who hold such values may be more inclined to trust and have solidarity with other people, including people in the in-group. So as I said, this is a bit speculative. I don't really have any evidence to back up these explanations, but they seem to me to be at least somewhat plausible explanations of why we might find these effects of holding particular values and attitudes to other people, such as trust and solidarity. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Niels. Next up, we have Fabian Schubert of the University of Potsdam on building trust and increasing social cohesion on the prospects of establishing a Republican social ethos for a better society.
Right, can you hear me? Perfect, thank you very much. So I will present to you something which has preciously little to say about trust in many ways, because I come to the topic from a slightly different angle. I primarily work on social equality and theories of non-domination and Republican political theory. So I will focus on the idea, which has been voiced in the literature, that when we talk about a just society, what we need is not just certain laws, certain general principles, but that in order to have a properly just society, that needs to be underpinned by something called a social ethos. And you find that in different strands of the political theory and political philosophy debate. One very prominent claim is from Jerry Cohen, who criticized Rawls's difference principle and says we also need an ethos. But you also find it in literature on Republican political theory. So Oldfield says it is a shared commitment, and in the process creates and maintains the social solidarity and cohesion of the community, which very nicely obviously ties in with some of the key concepts which were mentioned in the beginning with regards to the overarching topic of this conference. And then probably the most defender of what is called neo-Republican political theory, Philip Pettit, also talks about an ethos which a Republican society might need in order to be fully just. And it fulfills a particular function there. And I will come back to that in just a second. Now, what is meant by an ethos? One fairly prominent claim is by Joe Wolf, who says essentially an ethos is a set of underlying values, which may be explicit or implicit. If you actually go to the Oxford English Dictionary, as Sune Lagerth luckily did in one of his papers, so I could just copy it one-to-one. It's slightly different. It's the characteristic spirit or the prevalent tone of sentiment. So I want to go a little bit further in that direction. Obviously, shared values, underlying values play an important role. But if we look at how the idea of a social ethos is used in the literature, it seems beyond that. It seems to be about certain kinds of social norms, intuitive dispositions, as well as also maybe how we understand the world. So Jerry Cohen, who I mentioned on the last slide, talks about a social ethos and gives us the example of a camping trip. Now, when you go to a national park, you might have certain park rules, but then you also go there in a certain spirit. When you go on a camping trip, there's no bickering over who does the dishes. Everybody chips in, and that's that sense of community. We will see whether that's really the case. But Albertson, paraphrasing Cohen, says it's a set of beliefs in an egalitarian spirit affecting people's everyday choices, which obviously raises the question whether a camping trip is fully comparable to people's everyday choices, because most of us don't go everyday camping. Right, so looking at the neo-Republican literature, you will find two broad strands, and I just want to touch on them very, very briefly, hoping that we still tomorrow or day after tomorrow have a talk on non-domination and vigilance. I will say preciously little about it, but like the way that Philip Pettit primarily talks about it is to support the already existing institutions which are supposed to foster the idea of freedom as non-domination, so a particular way of how we should relate to each other in society. And the ethos is mainly there for two things, namely kind of a civility in which we engage with each other, which pairs at the same time with vigilance. So we have an ethos of free and honest expression. And that is particularly important because it allows us to make sure that our institutions, which are institutions partially built also on trusting people, not just controlling people, that they can't be taken over, that people can't be corrupted by being in positions of power and these kind of things. A very, in many ways, if you will, not a particularly thick understanding of the ethos, which is in a certain way exactly the opposite what you find in the other strand of neo-Republican theories. So broadly, they are distinguished into the Neo-Roman and the Neo-Athenians. I can talk more about that if you're really interested in it. I figured most of you are probably not expert on Republican political theory, so you might not care too much about it. Basically, there are two camps. The upper one, slightly more institutional approach, they really focus on the principle of non-domination. And then you have the others, which very strongly focus on virtuous behavior. They see political participation as intrinsically valuable. They believe that it generates certain epistemic gains for all the members of society. And now it's great, I can't read my own bottom there either. The bond of solidarity, can I move that? Yes, the bond of solidarity with my compatriots in a functioning republic is based on a sense of shared fate, where the sharing itself is of value. So there, as this Taylor quote shows, it's not just the idea that we share a common aim, that we share a certain understanding, that we're in this enterprise, namely in our republic together, but the sharing itself is really, really valuable. It's a really, really valuable element of what it means to be part of a Republican community, if you will. Now, both of these approaches I will move on from for two very different reasons. Why? First, with regard to the upper approach, which I mainly associate with Philip Pettit. The problem is here the social ethos actually doesn't do particularly much work, in the sense that if it's mainly about that kind of stability and vigilance, I think it misses some of the aspects which are normally associated with the claims which are otherwise attached to theories of a social ethos. What do I mean by that? I mean by that, the idea why so many people nowadays write about a social ethos is that they think it needs to be a fairly strong connection which really informs all sorts of everyday norms and interactions, which allow us to build the kind of community where people already foster the right kind of attitudes when they meet each other. And they engage with each other, so that they fill the idea that we are all free and equal members of the same community with life. That it's precisely that we need to go beyond just what the laws prescribe, which of course ideally should be built on equality. Everybody is equal before the law. And it's also not just about vigilance that nobody corrodes these institutions from within. While the second approach seems to be, and that is one of the reasons why it's less popular, if you will, in most of the mainstream literature, comes with quite a heavy burden on the other side. It comes with a very strong sense of shared community, which easily could turn in the wrong way, so be exclusionary if we're not very careful what kind of values we really have in there. It comes with a high demand in terms of people actually exhibiting particular virtues. And there the question is whether virtues are the best way to actually get to where the social ethos is supposed to get us. And lastly, it has very strong commitments to a particular idea of the good life, including that need to be politically participating, or as Robin Hahn recently put it in a debate when we talked about something similar, it's not everybody's cup of tea to deliberate every day or to debate every day until the cows come home, because some of us want to do other things. Right. There's another approach which I will say nothing about, but I thought I mention it. Mainly I mention it because I put it in the abstract which I submitted to the organizer, so I felt compelled to at least have one slide on it, namely the social egalitarian approaches. I already mentioned earlier Joe Wolf, which basically is the idea that what we need is a strong commitment to certain egalitarian values. I will say more about that later. There are other claims in the literature about a new social contract or norms of reciprocal respect. If you're really interested in that, we can talk about that later. I really want to focus on the Republican side of the argument, if you will. Then there's another strand which is called critical republicanism. The critical republicanism strand tries to say, this is all nice and well what Pettit and the others, the so-called neo-Roman Republicans, are doing, but they're too institutional. What we really need is to understand how messy social relations are and how important it is that we are aware of two factors which really make a difference to how our society functions. The first ones are focused on practices of justification. You find that in very diverse authors, whether it's Dorothea Gedeke or Rainer Forst, who stress the importance of justification so that you can explain to everybody the kind of values on which the society is actually built. Now, I think the problem here is that is obviously an important aspect in general of how we think how our political systems should work. So we do think that justifying our choices in terms of reasons which other can at least reasonably understand is important, but it's obviously not the only aspect of what is important. So you can think of a theory like Tim Scanlon's, which quite easily, Scanlon doesn't mention an ethos anywhere, as far as I remember, in What We Owe to Each Other or any of his following publications. So the practice of justification might not be everything that we want to connect with the idea of a social ethos, or if it is, then why do we need to talk of a social ethos? The different strand of the critical civility, of the critical republicanism tradition focuses more on something called critical civility. So they focus on the regimes of social disapproval and how we use certain forms of social recognition to enforce social norms. So there, the key question is that obviously is a very important aspect when we think about how societies work, how we get people to behave in certain ways, right? We want to reward people for holding certain attitudes. We want to show them that certain kinds of statements, attitudes, practices are not okay. The key issue there is obviously that we need to talk about the values or the kind of social norms which ought to structure social interactions. So what are the kind of values which you normally find in the literature, and or at least in that part of the literature which I think is the most promising when it really comes to looking at the broader effects of what a social ethos can do on top of all these claims about just institutions, just laws, greater distributive justice, or greater proximity to distributive justice. And that is non-domination, in particular also non-domination, meaning protection from the dominating effects of structural inequalities, like everyday sexism, racism, homophobia, many other things. And again, it's the aspect which also plays an important role in republicanism, but obviously even more so in the social equality literature, namely a particular understanding of social equality in terms of how we relate to each other in the full range of social relationships, rather than purely within political relationships or a purely formal understanding of equality. So it's not just about formal equality in front of the law. And if we take that seriously, then I think we can take our bearings from some literature which actually tries not to say that much about an ethos, but tries to say something about problematic social norms within the societies in which we live, the liberal democracies in which we live. So there's an interesting text by Tsakaltos who writes that one of the key issues that we have is how individuals perceive themselves as acquisitive maximizers. And I just saw the 2-minute sign, so I really need to speed up. Though Niels probably spoke 2 minutes less than 15 minutes. So maybe we can find an arrangement. So there are obviously downsides to particular ways of how we frame the world in the very first instance, how we think about social relations, how we think about what kind of behaviors are okay. So, and I think that's where the idea of a social ethos has in a certain way the most mileage, and it's not even, it's neither an original claim nor a particularly recent claim. So you can go back to people like Tony, who not only wrote a great book about equality, but also wrote a great book about the acquisitive society and the changing social norms within, for lack of a better word, liberal capitalist societies and how people relate to each other. And there are certain perversive ways of how we think about social interactions, which I think are precisely the kind of point where we would have to start inquiring more deeply what exactly a social ethos should be about. Namely, also going beyond certain distinctions which we find in also the theoretical literature, namely sometimes a too strong focus only about so-called political questions, and not enough thinking about these social and economic realities which inform how people relate to each other in society. And that's why I put in parentheses, slightly provocative, whether that means you're moving more into the direction of a socialist ethos rather than a social ethos. That's obviously a provocation. But it goes back to one of the points which Cohen made in his critique of Rawls, namely that certain relations, in particular certain market relations, perceptions of individualist utility maximization and so on, might be incompatible with the more deeply held normative commitments, the shared values possibly, which we talked about, of our conceptions of justice, our conceptions of equality. And if that is the case, then it's not just that practices of justification are important, it's also obviously that beliefs, attitudes, and intentions matter, but also that we talk about the deeper internalized narratives and frames, which we really need to have a change in habits and how we frame our interaction as individuals in a society, because that seems to what the claim of an ethos then really seems to be about. And that's where I'm going to stop, because now it's 16 minutes and 45 seconds. So sorry, I took some of your time. Yes, coming.
Thank you so much, Fabian. And next we have Ale Duolu from the Western University on distrust, privilege, and invulnerability.
Oh, let me see. Oops. That's spoilers. Yeah, could you help me out with that? I don't know how to do that. Is it like this? What are you doing? Yeah. Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to talk about distrust from a perspective that's not necessarily informed by political theory, but from my background in philosophy and specifically feminist philosophy. So I'm from Western University. I'm in the Women's Studies department, but I did my MA in philosophy and sort of shuffle back and forth between the two. So there's going to be a background of kind of feminist theory in this presentation. Okay. So distrust has become a hot topic as of late, as maybe some of you have noticed. A cursory online search brings up tons of articles that urgently point to an apparent trend of growing distrust, especially in institutions such as healthcare and policing. And this is specific to North America in this case, although I think it can be applied to Western Europe as well. Conversations around the problem of distrust are often centered on the distrust of oppressed people. Particularly people of color, and this is in relation to institutional distrust specifically. So for instance, Black and Indigenous people have been repeatedly singled out in North America and in Western Europe as uniquely mistrusting of the COVID-19 vaccine. There's also a close focus on race with respect to attitudes of distrust against the police in North America. So clearly the pandemic, alongside Black Lives Matter protests that have happened worldwide recently, have drawn attention to the topic of institutional distrust felt by marginalized groups in the West. So the scrutiny, while certainly overdue in some ways, does not come without its drawbacks. As we'll see up here, Yolanda Wilson has recently argued that questions like, why don't Black people trust the US healthcare system, often pathologize Black people and their distrust, implying that there is something wrong with them rather than something wrong with the conditions within which they exist. Wilson contends that even attempts to explain Black people's distrust of the medical system in the US, so for instance, with reference to the long history of racist medical abuse, fail to fully capture the harms that they have experienced in these contexts. Such questions also obfuscate the role that those in power have played in fostering a climate of distrust within which these relationships take place. So taking Wilson's critique seriously, in the paper that I'm presenting, I examine distrust kind of from a different direction, which is to say from the top down. I argue that privileged social locations are liable to predispose us to a kind of distrust that is rarely remarked upon, and this is specific to the philosophy of trust and distrust, which is that distrust that is couched in a desire to seek and or preserve a state of invulnerability in relation to the one being distrusted. This desire for invulnerability by those who are relatively privileged, or by privileged I mean relatively powerful along axes of, for instance, race or gender or nationality. Whether this desire is consciously felt or not is wrapped up in existing power dynamics, like I said, and the resulting distrust tends to target those who are comparatively oppressed in society. So I engage with three contexts which feature this kind of distrust, which is the Me Too movement in North America, anti-trans legislative efforts in the US again, and pro-police narratives that have circulated in popular discourse following the Black Lives Matter movement. Ultimately, I conclude that invulnerability-seeking top-down distrust is pernicious as it helps to maintain and perpetuate oppressive status quos in North America. So white supremacy, misogyny, and transphobia in this case. Okay. Yeah. So Annette Beyer, those of you who come to this conference from a place of philosophy of trust will probably be very familiar with Annette Beyer, but she framed trust as both a response to and a generator of vulnerability. So we trust people because we're inherently dependent on each other. So we're inherently vulnerable to each other. And in trusting, we render ourselves even more vulnerable to those on whom we depend. So although Beyer's goodwill account, her account of trust is generally called the goodwill account of trust, it's received its fair share of philosophical criticism. But there remains some agreement among those working in the philosophy of trust that vulnerability, risk, and trust go hand in hand. Curiously, however, the implied connection between distrust and invulnerability isn't really explored in this literature. And to my knowledge, there's no well-developed theory of distrust which draws from Beyer's work to center the concept of vulnerability. And in my view, this is partly because distrust doesn't really enjoy the same level of attention in philosophy that trust does. But even so, those who have written about distrust seem to agree in general that the attitude involves, for instance, a desire to keep another at arm's length as much as possible. Jason DeCruz and Karen Jones have argued that distrust is typically accompanied by feelings of insecurity, cynicism, contempt, hatred, or fear in relation to another. DeCruz has also speculated that perhaps distrust is a defensive stance which responds to another person as a threat. So if Beyer is correct in her observation that trust emerges in response to the fact of our inherent interdependence and vulnerability, then it follows that the same holds true for distrust. After all, in caring for the things that we value most in life and caring for them well, we sometimes entails distrusting those we perceive as threats to these things in order to protect what we care about from harm. For example, distrusting a reckless cab driver could protect me from physical harm if it moves me to exit a dangerous situation, or distrusting a friend who I know to be kind of gossipy could protect me from emotional or social harm if it makes me keep my secrets to myself. So while the warrant or seriousness of the threat that another might pose to us, as well as our specific feelings in relation to them, can and do vary from case to case, the attitude of distrust seems to nonetheless be imbued with a concern for safety or protection in the face of our interdependence and our vulnerabilities to one another. Distrust also seems to involve an effort to minimize our vulnerabilities as much as possible. This minimization can sometimes be so extreme that it amounts to a pursuit of invulnerability in relation to the one being distrusted. If I distrust a friend so much to the extent that I remove them from my life, for example, one could argue that I'm seeking to be invulnerable from them. If I distrust my physician to the extent that I stop going to them, one could argue that I'm seeking invulnerability by withdrawing from future interactions with them. If this formulation of distrust is reasonable, then distrust sometimes involves a desire or pursuit of invulnerability from those we see as suspicious, incompetent, dangerous, or otherwise hostile to us. So what does the desire or pursuit of invulnerability have to do with power or privilege that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation? So feminist philosopher Nancy Anna Romao has argued that the dominant North American social construction of vulnerability as weakness and invulnerability as strength is simultaneously a product and a vanguard of patriarchal oppression in North America. Anna Romao contends that privilege situates dominant groups in society as largely invulnerable, so materially speaking, for example, in ways that lead them to aspire to even greater invulnerability or strength in order to access greater social power. This is because, according to patriarchal myths, total invulnerability can be achieved given enough innovation, drive, and if necessary, force. Anna Romao reveals that the desire for invulnerability from the other is difficult to extricate from the operations of power. This desire is also often pursued by dominant groups through the exertion of violence against those who are comparatively marginalized. Similarly, Erin Gilson has argued that the unwillingness to experience vulnerability is part and parcel of what she calls a posture of sovereignty, and which can be understood as a way of seeing the world and others in it that is both shaped by and perpetuates relations of domination. This posture of sovereignty rests, for Gilson, on a disavowal of one's ontological and situational vulnerabilities as a social, finite, relational, and embodied being in constant, inescapable contact with other people. This disavowal of vulnerability coheres with dominant forms of subjectivity, which are privileged in capitalist economic systems. So that of the prototypical, arrogantly self-sufficient, independent, and invulnerable master subject. Invulnerability is a desirable pursuit under oppressive systems which run on the notion of a master subject, such as capitalism, white supremacy, systemic misogyny, etc., because this pursuit continually validates the idea that full security or full control is an achievable goal. Crucially, however, total invulnerability is an impossibility. We cannot avoid our ontological vulnerabilities any more than we can cease to be human beings and community one another and assent to something like godhood. Recalling Bayer, we also cannot eradicate our special vulnerabilities unless we refuse to trust anyone altogether. So Gilson demonstrates that the posture of sovereignty necessitates a paradoxical, continuous, and ultimately futile quest for invulnerability. This quest involves ignoring or destroying aspects of reality which are disruptive, unsettling, or uncomfortable. So to be clear at this point, I don't think all distrust perpetuates oppression. I know I've kind of implied that from the literature so far. Indeed, sometimes seeking to minimize one's vulnerabilities can be a way of resisting oppression. If distrust from the top works to continually sort of stabilize this inherently insecure posture of the sovereign, then distrust from the bottom is a justified reaction to communal histories of subjugation. And Meena Krishnamurthy, for instance, has argued that distrust can be a strategic tool for oppressed communities to safeguard themselves from tyranny. So distrust itself is morally ambivalent in this sense. It can resist oppression just as it can perpetuate it. It is the context, direction, and location from which distrust emerges that is worth examining, and the power relations that exist in these contexts. And we can see all of these elements of top-down we can see all these elements of top-down distrust in practice by considering some examples. But before I get to the examples, I want to quickly distinguish two types of vulnerability or invulnerability that I argue that dominant groups pursue in these examples. The first is material vulnerability or invulnerability. That's, I think, pretty self-explanatory. You can understand it as wealth, for example, or being shielded from consequence or accountability. And the second is constitutive vulnerability or constitutive invulnerability. That's a bit more involved, and I draw a lot from feminist literature in describing constitutive vulnerability in my paper. But essentially, what constitutive vulnerability or invulnerability is our vulnerability to one another at sort of the level of the self. So assuming that we are inherently sort of relational people whose sense of self, sense of identity, sense of, for instance, even physical presentations of things like gender, race, sexuality, et cetera, assuming that these things are relationally constituted, which is what feminists argue, then we are inherently vulnerable to one another at the level of the self. Right. I just skipped a bunch of stuff, but anyways. So the idea is that dominant groups are not only relatively constitutively invulnerable to a degree, not only relatively materially invulnerable to a degree, sorry, but relatively constitutively invulnerable in the sense that they are resistant to being defined from below, and also resistant to having this relative power challenged by other definitions of themselves. So I know this is all a bit theoretical, but to get more specific, hopefully, okay, I'm 2 minutes. Okay, so my first example in this case is the Me Too movement, which, as probably many of you know, saw countless women on social media coming forward to talk about their experiences of rape, of harassment, typically by men in positions of power. So the central argument here is that men's distrust of women's testimonies in particular in these kinds of contexts display not only a desire to maintain relative material invulnerability in the sense that as a class that they are shielded from accountability in these sorts of contexts, but also a desire for constitutive invulnerability in the sense that women's testimonies in the public arena, which during the movement was, thousands of people on social media every day coming forward to talk about this. And the increasing number of testimonies, I argue, posed a threat to men's self-conceptions or their sense of identity or their sense of self-perception as sort of atomized, individual, self-sufficient, invulnerable individuals who are not implicated as a class in this kind of oppression, right? So these testimonies, I argue, pose a threat to these self-understandings of men. The second example, sort of speed through this so that I can don't go over time. But the second example in my paper is recent anti-trans legislation in the United States and the sort of top-down distrust that occurs in these contexts where cis people don't trust, or actually they distrust trans people's testimonies regarding their experiences of gender. And I argue in the paper that this is also an instance of sort of resistance to being constitutively vulnerable in the sense that these reactions or this distrust is an attempt to protect cis people's perceptions of, for instance, gender and who gets to define womanhood and who gets to define manhood and who gets to present their gender in a way that's broadly socially legible. So I see the same sort of conflict here as I see in the Me Too movement, which is that their sort of personal identity and self-perception is threatened, which sort of generates this kind of distrust. And the third example is the distrust of white people, particularly during the Black Lives Matter movement, in relation to people of color's testimonies regarding police violence. And to center on constitutive vulnerability again, I see the same sort of, you could say it's epistemic resistance to a degree, but I see the same sort of constitutive resistance to being defined by this reality, which is being put forward in the public arena, in the sense that there is a systemic pattern of police violence, a racialized systemic pattern of police violence, and the distrust that white people feel, especially towards these kinds of testimonies I think reflects an unwillingness to be constitutively vulnerable to this reality, essentially to the idea that, for instance, the US is structured to some degree on white supremacy, and that white people are afforded certain privileges, right? And white people enjoy these privileges without really knowing that they enjoy these privileges. So when these sorts of narratives are really proliferated in society, it becomes a challenge to this idea of whiteness as neutral, as invisible, as the norm. And I think the response of distrust is really reactionary in the sense that it threatens people's conceptions of themselves and understandings of themselves, and also their understandings of the world that they're in. So those are the main three arguments, main three cases that I discussed with respect to this argument. And I'm going to wrap up really quickly. Yeah, so this is kind of the generic. Of course, I'm not arguing that all men or all white people or all cis people, etc., feel this way or feel this kind of distrust or even consciously feel this kind of reactionary defensiveness. And I'm also not suggesting that this is preordained or that it can't be escaped or it can't be sort of challenged and thought through. But especially philosophers who write about trust and distrust know that trust and distrust are really resilient, and they resist counter evidence for the most part, and they kind of sustain themselves in affective loops. So it's not preordained. It's not that it can't be changed, but there's certainly, from what I see, granted it's very theoretical, but from what I see from these examples is that there's certainly a kind of predisposition in terms of how power is flowing in the way that this distrust also flows downwards. Yeah, and I think that this kind of understanding or the centering of vulnerability and invulnerability and distrust offers us another way to think about prejudicial trust and the claim that our trust is open to being corrupted by things like racism, sexism, transphobia. Well, that's definitely true. I think this work also suggests that these attitudes are themselves fundamentally contextual and that they're related to our collective competing kind of class interests, even if this is not consciously known or felt. I think just in terms of the way this distrust manifests, that indicates not just social values, but interests in terms of the investments that people have in existing dynamics of power. So is that okay? Did I go over? Okay. Do I take off the mic or? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you, Ale. Now, any questions?
Thank you. Thanks so much. These are great presentations. I have two questions, comments to Fabian and sorry, is it Hale
yeah.
and Hale? Fabian, I was just interested in what you think about Joshua Cohen's critique of Jerry Cohen's critique of roles, where it says that, well, look, roles never said, right, that ethos type of things are not a thing, because this is precisely what stability is about, right? How well-ordered society generates attitudes and etc. And kind of you ended up saying that, well, look, we already live in a society that generates an ethos. We just need to make sure that it generates a different kind of ethos. And that to me seems very much kind of going back to roles and away from Cohen. And I'm just interested in what you think about maybe that move, which I think is the right move, at least what I would do. And to Hale, I think, I was wondering if you think it might make sense to distinguish between distrust and mistrust in these contexts, because when I encounter those kinds of reactions, I tend to see a difference between people expressing kind of incredulity about these testimonies or the extent of injustice, etc., and people, and usually the more reactionary people who think that these groups are up to something, and they're actively suspicious and distrusting in the sense not just that they are incredulous, but they actually think that they are kind of malicious and they are plotting, and so is making the difference meaningful here, or do you think one is just a kind of they are the same, it's just some people don't realize that what they do is actually the same as these kind of slightly conspiratorial type of distrust? Wondering about that. Thank you very much.
Sure, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thanks for your question, Joel. In general, the project looking at the ethos is actually quite far away from mainly looking at Rawls and Cohen, but since you asked about it, one of the things which, because I was so pressed for time and probably also because it still feels like I haven't slept enough, that's my excuse for everything today. I didn't talk enough about some of those background arguments which are being given, right? Why we at all need to talk about an ethos, and talking about principles of justice and institutions is not enough. And what seems to play an important role there is that we observe social division, social frictions, and so on, and people lose at all the feeling that even if they live in institutions which don't necessarily seem to disadvantage them overly, that they are doing okay. And I think part of the critique which Cohen, even though obviously he's not a particularly empirically minded guy in general, got right, is that it has a lot to do with social inequalities and their corroding effects. And that Rawls talking about stability doesn't seem to take that worry seriously enough. And in a certain way, I think the same could be said for Pettit, right? Who also thinks that talking about non-domination will solve lots of these issues. And that's why I combine that Republican and the social egalitarian bit, because the social egalitarians, as you know, are really, really worried about particular forms of social inequality and their corroding effects. And that's how I got there. And that's why I somehow see the stability question then differently as well, which is not a very direct answer to your question, I know, but at least it allows me to say something which I didn't say during my presentation. Forgive me for that.
Yeah, so thanks for your question. With regards to the distinction between distrust and mistrust, again, like I said, I come from, like, disciplinary wise, from a background in philosophy and the philosophy of trust and distrust. And this distinction does not, to my knowledge, really exist in that literature to say that, for instance, pernicious kinds of distrust, which is irrational or not based in reality, to say that that's mistrust, that's not really typical in that literature. But especially from the keynote, I really want to actually look into that going forward. But my intuition to some degree is also that there might be some danger to saying you're talking about distrust generally, and then sort of no true Scotsmaning mistrust or pernicious distrust to a side, and sort of thinking about that separately. And it's not, I mean, like I said, that's my intuition. It's not something that I've really sat down and thought about. It's something that I'm going to think about in the future. But I think there is, like I said, some maybe just purely theoretical danger in separating those two things and sort of theorizing about them from two separate places. I do think it has mostly to do with the grounds of that distrust in relation to whether it responds to sort of material conditions of subjugation or something that doesn't exist, right? A kind of oppression that doesn't exist, but it's still reactionary, and the people who feel those things think it exists. That's one thing. And also what I've tried to highlight in this presentation is that it kind of is about interests, right? Even if it's not consciously felt. Yeah, so to wrap it up, that distinction is not something that I've really thought about thus far. But I'm going to think about it going forward, and maybe it might be even if it's just, semantically or linguistically to distinguish it that way might be helpful. But yeah, thank you for your question.
All right, so there's a question online from Patty Leonard saying, thanks to everyone for the interesting comments. Niels, I'm wondering if there is another explanation for why shared values would generate trust. What if the belief or knowledge that people shared values reduces the risk associated with extending trust and thereby leads to more trust?
Just repeat the last bit.
What if the belief knowledge that people shared values reduces the risk associated with extending trust and thereby leads to more trust? Wondering if there is another explanation for why shared values would generate trust.
Okay. So I don't know really whether I can ask questions back here, but what would be the mechanism involved? Okay, great. Yeah.
Hello, does that work? Am I talking to you?
Yes, you are.
Oh, hi, Niels, and thanks for your talk. Sorry, I was just typing in. So like, I don't know exactly what you mean by mechanism, but my thought is, my thought is that trust, this is what Halle was describing, right? Trust is, makes you put yourself in a position of vulnerability. And then you can have relations which are cooperative or solidaristic and such like that. So the mechanism would be that to the extent that I believe others share my values, right? So your explanation was possibly that I have these values, which leads me to trust, and expressing skepticism about the idea that it's the sharing that does the work. And what I wanted to say is that the knowledge of sharing, like that we share, that I share it with these people, tells me that the risks associated with trust are sort of decreased. And so I can engage in cooperative, collaborative, solidaristic relations with others because the risk of doing so is decreased.
Yeah. So I guess my response would be that the extent to which I would be justified in trusting other people because I know that they share my values would depend on what my values are, right? So if I knew that I was pretty untrustworthy, I have values that make me perhaps in general untrustworthy, and knowing that other people are like that, why would that incline me to trust them? So I think a lot is about the values. I don't want to say that it's all about values and not about sharing, because I can see how they're part of what Gina was saying, or at least hinting at, I think, was that there might be different mechanisms involved here. That there's one mechanism that comes from identifying with other people, and then there might be a different mechanism that comes from values. I think also that there might be an impact of sharing values, but I think that if so, it would depend on what those values are. I don't really see the argument for saying that just because someone shares my values, I would be inclined to trust them more. I think it would depend on what the values are. And I think perhaps one reason why we don't think of it that way is that we tend to think about nice values when we think about these questions. But of course, values needn't be nice.
I'm so sorry. Am I allowed to come back? I can't tell. I can't read the room from my vantage point. Okay, so sure, like that. Obviously, the content matters. I agree with that. But so why do multiculturalists? So one explanation for why multiculturalists or liberals are more trusting is that they have values which lead them in that direction. But what they might also believe, a multiculturalist might also believe, is that integration has gone well, that immigrants or minorities of other kinds share key values like tolerance, like a willingness to live and let live, a general openness to other people. And I believe that they share those values because the integration process has gone well. And so I believe that the content of the values that we share in common are trusting. And I like that seems to me a plausible explanation, even if we do focus on what the content of the values are, it's still the sharing of relevant content, like values that are sort of have a particular content.
No, I think that's right. And I think that might be a possible mechanism. So as I mentioned, we also looked at the extent to which it made a difference, for instance, for multiculturalists, whether they thought other people shared their values. And actually, multiculturalists who thought that other people shared their values were less trusting than multiculturalists who thought that other people didn't share their values, which was, you know, kind of surprising. And perhaps speaks a bit against the mechanism we're talking about. Although I do think that there might be, the explanation here might be that multiculturalists who express that other people don't share their values might just be saying that, or acknowledging that they live in a society of diversity and that people differ in their views and attitudes and traditions and so on. That might just be a way of expressing that. And so perhaps it's, you know, they would still be more inclined to trust other people insofar as these other people share their political values. So it's not just about cultural differences, but it's about political values. So there's that possible explanation, at least, of why we found what we found, which is compatible with sharing multicultural values actually having a positive impact on trust.
Okay, thanks so much for your question. Anyone else?
Thanks. Just a comment on that. A potentially interesting place to study whether shared values actually reaches that would be like dating apps, because you can now put your values on your dating apps, and do people actually like you more? Anyways, Hala, my question is actually for you, and it's I'm curious about how intersectionality would come into this. So being not just, you know, thinking about one identity marker, but how they interact across. And the reason I'm thinking about that is because of the convoy movement in Canada, for example, of when we were talking about flags earlier, I was thinking about how the Canadian flag has changed completely since the convoy movement, but as an aside, because those are folks who tend to be more conspiracy theorists, have that ethos of distrust in some ways of the mainstream media. But then those are also the same group that also enact a lot of whiteness and I guess my question comes into your idea of top down versus bottom up, because that group might be quote unquote the top down in some of these instances that you gave, but the bottom up, depending on how you look at it in others. So I'm curious about that binary and if it always works and how you think about intersectionality in that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So to start, this binary that I use in the paper is kind of instrumental in the sense that I don't think obviously it's a binary. It's sort of a description of a dynamic. I used it more in that way, as opposed to saying, oh, there's a class of people that are, you know, privileged with respect to everything all the time, and they enact this kind of domination. That's of course not the case, especially drawing from literature on intersectionality. And in the longer version of the presentation, obviously, I discuss also how this kind of pernicious distrust can also be adopted by people who are marginalized along those lines, actually. So working against their own interests to some degree. I think that also happens. I think this was also a part of, especially the Me Too movement, where I don't want to say a lot because I don't think that was the case, but there were certain survivors who, for instance, came out and said they didn't believe certain sort of people who were talking about their own victimization. So I think this kind of distrust which operates against your own interests also occurs, and that's something that really should be discussed. The reason I made that distinction in the paper is because I wanted to focus on something that was kind of easier to explain and theorize about, but I do think intersectionality obviously complicates things. And in general, I think when it happens, it's people working against their own interests to some degree, or because they're invested in the structure of power and they are offered a certain degree of sort of marginal power in those environments, as opposed to sort of like a communal understanding of oppression of these circumstances. So does that kind of answer your question? And what was did you have a second point, or did I? Okay. Yeah, so yeah, that's kind of what I think, and I kind of get more into it in the paper, but I just didn't have a lot. But yeah, thank you for asking about it.
Okay, right over here.
I would have a question to all three of you, which is sort of related to each other. So to you, Niels, could it be the case that those who have those liberal and multicultural attitudes, did you check their socioeconomic background so that they are much more trustful because they are not vulnerable, as Halle would say?
We control for socioeconomic background and self-placement on a left-right political scale.
Okay. Okay, so no, because my impression would be that they have, I mean, that their values, it's not the values that let them trust out-group people, but it's just that they have an invulnerability, a socioeconomic invulnerability, which makes them be much more at ease with the world, okay? And then is the question for you, Fabian, is what does non-domination say actually about invulnerability? Does it take this dimension into account? Does it have a dimension of care, or is non-domination just, as a matter of fact, concerned with not dominating the person, but then whatever, if I don't not dominate the person, but the person is still in a bad situation, then it doesn't care about that to some. I mean, would it say something about that? I hope that you got it.
Yeah, no, I got it.
And then the last question to you, Hade. So you talk a lot about vulnerability and about distrust now, and the way you put it is to some extent that you get out of this distrust if the people from a privileged group, they would have more of this hermeneutic justice. I mean, to put it into Fricker, I think you put it much into Frickerian terms. So you want to say that. But isn't it, but don't we need more, I mean, to decrease their invulnerability than just to take them seriously? I mean, don't we really have to act on a much more deeper level, probably on a more physical, emotional level, to make them feel at ease, secure somehow, in order that this distrust, because I really agree that you are on the right track, that distrust is really there where, well, invulnerability occur. Okay.
So I keep it really short because I think we also had still a couple of other questions. Very good question. It obviously depends on what you mean by non-domination. And as so often, probably the person most strongly associated with non-domination, which is Philip Pettit, does have some weaknesses in his account of non-domination. That's why I explicitly mentioned structural injustices, like, for instance, epistemic injustices and so on, which quite many scholars working on non-domination are acutely aware of and think that domination needs to speak to those rather than just the classical political domination, which was the starting point, if you will, in the first instance. So in my understanding of non-domination, yeah, it covers that. That's precisely the point. But you need to make the concept work in that direction. And that's why you probably also have to say goodbye to some of the things which Pettit says in terms of there's one simple principle, right? He does the John Stuart Mill move at some point early in his work and says non-domination is one principle and it allows us to do everything. And I think if what person comes around the corner with one principle, you should be really worried as a good philosopher.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for that question. To answer your first comment, I do talk about hermeneutical resources and hermeneutical injustice in the paper. I just didn't have time to sort of put it up there and get into it really. But to answer the second question, if I understood it correctly, you're saying if this kind of pernicious distrust exists and it comes from a place of real fear or real vulnerability, not in the sense of like material vulnerability, but real felt vulnerability, right? I would be hesitant to say that we need to move toward appeasing this or like making people who feel those things feel more secure, because I think that's kind of one, I think that conflicts with literature on trust and distrust, which is to say that if someone is distrusting and you try to appeal for trust from them, that attitude can calcify even more, because if someone is prone to conspiratorial thinking in the first place and you start approaching them in that way, that can also be a part of the conspiracy, right? So flat earthers who believe those things, if you go up to them and try to have a conversation and say, well, look, here's the evidence, and I'm trying to, understand you and talk to you, that person can calcify in their beliefs even more, because then it's like, oh, they're trying to change my mind kind of thing. That would be one concern. The second concern is a moral concern, which I think, I don't want to generalize, and I'll speak from my experience. I'm from Turkey, and from Turkey's political situation. I think the more you try to appease that kind of extreme, particularly like sort of right-wing sort of emotional responses, you end up swinging politically more and more to the right in order to appease those kinds of people. So I think understanding that it comes from a place of real felt emotion would be important. I don't know if that should lead us to appease those people in certain ways. Yeah, so I think there's a risk, but I do think we need to understand that there is like an actual felt emotion, instead of just being like, oh, they're crazy, oh, they're just whatever. But that doesn't mean, you have to sit down with them and try to make them feel less unsafe because of those loops in distrust. I don't think it's easily breakable, is where I'm getting to. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think I just answered it, but yeah, we did control for socioeconomic background, age, income, education, and then also for ideology. Yeah.
I have a quick question for Neil. I think it's very interesting to separate between the nature of the values and also the shared value. So, but just maybe I missed that, empirically, how you separate between the nature of values and people sharing the values.
Yeah, so of course that's difficult to do, but what we did was that we asked people about whether they thought that they shared their values with other people, or whether other people had their values, and we looked at whether that made a difference for the trust levels and solidarity levels of these 4 different groups. And generally found that it made no difference, and when it made a difference, it made a negative difference. Yeah, so that's how we tried to empirically test it. But as I also said, you can come up with explanations why you find that negative correlation, even though perhaps if you had just made people aware that we're talking about political values here, perhaps it would have looked differently. I don't know.
Thanks. Just a really quick question for Niels. I just wonder, in this empirical work, how is trust measured, and how is it understood?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a debate zone. So we had 3 different measures. So one was what's sometimes called generalized trust, and the specific wording of that was whether you think strangers can be trusted. That was how we asked it. And then do you think you can trust other Danes? And do you think you can trust immigrants? Those were our questions, the questions we used. Yeah.
My question is for Hallie as well. So I was wondering about invulnerabilities as a thing that affords you trust, and from the perspective of, and that makes you mistrust accounts of oppressed people, right? Because trust can function, or does function sometimes, as a lens through which we start interpreting the world. So that one way, for example, that can be, as you have described, that we want to maintain privilege or certain worldviews. but I wanted to ask you about whether you also think that sometimes it's, akin to standpoint theory, where just our actual invulnerability due to privilege makes us kind of like overly trustful, so that accounts that go against this trusting picture we have, we just naturally distrust. We just think, this is not how the world is, right? These are good people around us. They don't do these things. This is not what I have experienced. I know them. They are good people. And how that comes in to, especially because I found it really interesting how you framed it as seeking to eradicate invulnerability. So I was wondering how that, invulnerability as a footing trust actually comes in.
Yeah, so if I just checking if I understood the question correctly, are you saying that by virtue of someone's social power, for instance, if we're talking about white people, for instance, white people trust each other in the sense that if somebody comes up to them and talks about racialized violence, for instance, or racism in the classroom or something like that, where they're resistant to believe that because they are in the group and they trust each other. Is that? Yeah. 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 And I do think that's the case. And I think, yeah, I do think that's the case. I think the way that I would probably describe that is not just ignorance or not knowing or sort of willful ignorance or not having access to sort of different epistemic resources with which to, because I think those sort of explanations have become less and less sort of feasible to some degree. And not to say that they don't play a role in that anymore, but I think it's less feasible just by virtue of how society functions now to some degree in North America. But I'm more tempted to say it's a sort of unconscious resistance to taking in new information in that way. And also, this is the reason why I focused on sort of class interests mostly in this presentation, because I think, I mean, there's one way of understanding that, which is to say that like, oh, it's just, a coincidence that their trust flows this way or their distrust flows this way. But I think if your distrust flows in alignment with your class interests, that's something sort of, not to say that they necessarily cause each other. Again, this is theoretical work, but I think it's more than a coincidence that it flows in that direction. And I think, I don't know if I would say it breeds a sort of blind trust in sort of the in-group. Maybe it does, but I think the principal thing is that it breeds a kind of epistemic resistance to taking on new information and allowing that to sort of reorder your perception, your self-perception, your group perception, and those sorts of things. So hopefully that answered the question.
All right, I think we'll wrap this section up here for now. I think we have food has arrived, and I believe some of you are looking for a refill on your coffee, and I think that has also arrived. So yeah, we have about an hour, I think, till we come back in.